Okay, well, the title that I gave this is called Philosophy-Psychoanalysis and the Question of Evil. Does evil exist, or is it merely a social invention? Is evil an action, a disposition, a property, a consequence, and or a characteristic that necessarily makes it what it is, essentially? Does it hinge on creating pain for others, from relatively benign modes of discomfort to harm and gratuitous suffering? Does malicious intent have to be involved, or simply just intent, even if not malicious? Surely pain can result without intent. So what is the relationship between harm and human motivation? What if an event that brings about harm and suffering was not due to a direct action, but rather a failure to act, such as in a weakness of will, the bystander effect, or a miscarriage of moral courage? Here we may describe evil as the abnegation of responsibility, the failure to choose, the denial of freedom. But what happens if these failures are unconsciously informed, even chosen, the product of an unconscious will toward evil? Or are these queries contingent upon value judgments we ascribe to events and their causal attributions? One of the more traditional arguments from evil comes from Immanuel Kant when he refers to radical evil. Now, Kant's treatise on evil does not attribute evil to original sin, nor to turning away from God, nor does it conform to the Augustinian denial of evil, since it's nothing but the privation of good, not even to human want or desire, but rather is due to free choice. Evil is the product of our determinate powers of choice, because for Kant, we are radically free to determine the grounds for the sake of which to behave. This places the onus of responsibility squarely on the existential agent making such choices, and not on natural inclination, impulse, or desire. For, as Kant tells us, quote, the source of evil can lie only in a rule made by the will for the use of its freedom. That is, in a maxim, end quote. So even though we are born with innate needs, desires, longings, dispositions, and impulses, man is the author of his nature due to acts of free will, as choice, that either conform to or neglect the moral realm. This so-called freedom of moral will that generates maxims upon which all human beings supposedly construct for themselves is a purely determining, autonomous spontaneity of choice, and is therefore influenced by mental incentives. And for Kant, the moral law is the judgment of reason, and it is itself an incentive, and whoever makes use of its maxim is morally good, whereas deviation from the moral injunction makes one an evil man, as he would say. Kant believes that such a disposition toward choosing good or evil is a matter of free choice, and as such, natural a priori predeterminations are contradictory to the principles of choice, as one cannot freely choose what is given or thrown. But are dispositions always freely chosen? Are not urges, impulses, inclinations, and wants also mediated by other forces outside of one's immediate agentic will, awareness, and intent? Propensities, he argues, are acquired and therefore not necessarily innate, although they are naturally predisposed by virtue of the fact that we crave and have penchants and susceptibilities. But how can he justify the claim that we are predisposed to be inclined to freely choose any course of action unless we are subjected to particularized experiences? Moreover, if we are predisposed to be free agents, are we not necessarily conditioned on naturalized tendencies, hence our embodiment? Our corporeality is a necessary condition for actualizing free choice. although it is far from a sufficient one. If we are naturally predisposed to freely choose, then are we not naturally predisposed to choose evil? Necessarily so. Left to our own natural devices, would we not likely choose what feels good in the moment, regardless of any moral maxims, much like a child in the candy store? Moral laws are not naturally given, for they are acquired. Morality is the education and imposition of culture. We can no more presuppose the moral law as a transcendental good than we can of evil, for every human activity is based on naturalized psychology. Kant behaves as though the so-called moral imperative is a metaphysical given in the universe, much like the physical laws governing our world and the cosmos, when it may be forcefully argued that morality is a human phenomenon. When Kant repeats his ethical mantra that, quote, there is no propensity to moral evil, for such a propensity must spring from freedom in the moral capacity of the will, end quote, he is presupposing a moral capacity to begin with adapted as a rational decision to live one's life according to moral maxims. On the one hand, Kant wants to champion a radical freedom by virtue of our capacity to choose evil, while on the other, denying our inherent necessity to such a choice that is by natural predisposition. In the end, for Kant, all choices derive from maxims of the will. Now, what is radical for Kant is the deliberate act of choosing evil in light of our conscious awareness of the moral law, which is tantamount to the free choice of violating our moral duty, hence a corruption of the will in selecting evil maxims. Although we are naturally inclined to do so, we are nonetheless responsible and accountable for it, which is brought on by ourselves. Evil is radical in the sense that it corrupts the grounds of all maxims, as he would say, which is subjectively chosen through perversity of the heart, human frailty, impurity, and vulnerability to wickedness and vice. For it is ultimately, as he put it, put out of tune the moral capacity to judge. Yet for Kant, the moral law is transcendentally given, hence presupposed, as is the notion that human beings freely choose their actions through rational means. Here Kant's theory of radical evil suffers from a theoretical prejudice to begin with, namely the belief in sober rationalism, as though people conduct their lives in deliberate fashions that embrace ethical principles and rules of behavior conforming to logical axioms in choice and action. This could not be farther from the truth of our primordial natures, for moral deliberation is a developmental triumph of the will, mediated by many psychological dynamics that ultimately inform any rational comprehension of desire. Kant ultimately makes evil a rational enterprise by choosing to follow a maxim in accord with duty and allegiance to the moral law, or what duty demands, as if morality is a purely rational decision. Furthermore, ethical attunement is either aligned or misaligned with some realm of moral metaphysical realism, once again freely chosen or ignored, rather than attributed to a moral idealism invented by humanity. Kant fails to reconcile the tensions, the tension arc between the faculty of desire and free will, and he begs the question of ethical duty by presupposing a transcendental moral law, as though it's preordained. Not to mention that we choose maxims to follow in rational ways rather than as emotionally expedient mediated events under the press of a whole host of extraneous factors and cultural environs. For example, when he says that, quote, the predisposition to personality is the capacity for respect for the moral law as in itself a sufficient incentive of the will, end quote, he fails to understand human nature as driven by other competing dynamic processes and conflicts that condition this will, especially those imposed by unconscious currents and environmental determinants. Here, evil impositions can come from a multitude of directions, having very little to do with free will. Evil begets evil, whether chosen or not. Is not the moral law an achievement of culture, at once an invention and an imposition of civilization? Kant's view of good and evil as rational choice succumbs to the prejudices of his day, concerned with upholding a Christian explanation of man's aberrant behavior, while salvaging a theodicy that insulates God from allowing evil. In the end, it is hardly a satisfactory account of the irrational, emotional, libidinal, and aggressive predilections that fester within our human natures, clamoring for release in various forms, under various guises and valences, and in various circumstances that stimulate their appearance. Contra Kant, moral law is not the providence of divine command, but rather a human calling. If evil is structurally constituted in all human beings, then evil is normative. It exists in all cultures, conditions our social relations with others, and is carried out in a variety of ways by people just like you and me. No one is immune from its signature or affliction. This is part and parcel of our fermenting pathos, or our suffering. It is the new psychopathology of everyday life. Psychoanalysis has cogently shown, like the Zimbardo and Milgram experiments, that human nature is oriented toward hurting others, including ourselves. All human beings have sadistic wishes, impulses, and aggressive tendencies, from jealousy, envy, rivalry, hate, the diabolic, death wishes, punishment fantasies, and the need to humiliate and destroy. This is part of our unconscious animal nature, morphed by experiencing the world. While personal and social defenses keep us from consciously embracing our unconscious destructive principles, vying for pleasure, greediness, decadence, excess, and egoistic hedonism. These empirical facts speak toward our unconscious motivations that condition our waking conscious desires. Of course, there are different instantiations of evil as qualitative classifications of the wrong, offering gradations and concrete appearances. But my point is that evil is ontologically prepared as a primordial violence permeating being itself. Asteroids collide, cosmic dust flickers, and every astronomical event is a physical energetic negotiation. There is no ontic difference in this basic proposition governing the universe or human relations, for each is merely a modification of the metaphysics of experience. In most discourse on evil, no one talks about unconscious intentionality, the evil within. And it is only by accident, on the occasion and condition of a non-conscious choice through the proverbial slip of the tongue, let's say, or a faulty achievement, that evil is allowed expression. Despite the fact that we are dominated by reflective choice via the power of consciousness, this does not eradicate the force and reverberation of unconscious teleology. In psychoanalysis, which has discovered the fact that universally we not only have the capacity to kill, we all have the wish to commit murder. In those who have developed sufficient superego defenses of conscience and of moral values, this wish is bulwarked against a strong desire for denial, repression, renunciation, and undoing, even reaction formation, such as those who going into helping professions to reverse or annul this unconscious artifact by making reparation for our lingering guilt. The violentization of human proclivity is historically proven and biologically conditioned, the backbone of civilization, one that is far more civil today than it is in its archy. But the way we come to apprehend our nature is humanized, as mentioned earlier, by our freedom to choose certain paths of thought and action, even under the strain of a lack of mentalization or affect regulation that colors our penumbrum of ethical choices. In what Adam Morton refers to as the barrier theory of evil, he emphasizes that the essence of evil motivation is the failure to block actions that ought not even to have been considered, end quote. Here he insists that most people filter out harmful actions to others when considering the right course of action. However, this does not displace motivation itself. Furthermore, it does not consider the fact that many actions are motivated and executed by unconscious telic forces that scarcely recognize the foreseeable results or outcomes that they have on others, especially when such pre-reflective enactments are carried out unconsciously. This framework, which to adjudicate evil also presumes a conscient bias, that moral motivation and behavior are rationally contemplated with self-conscious foresight to consider the penalties of our actions. The notion of instituting barriers and refraining from the wrongful breach of barriers once put into place are important factors in understanding patterns of motivation. Yet motivation and action are not always amenable to following a learned strategy or habitual procedure as rational deliberation of choice. Rather, people simply act and deal with the consequences later. Here we may observe that consciousness is not foreshadowed by overdetermined psychodynamic events that affect the conscious motivation and action of the agent, even if under disinhibition or self-deceptive currents. This may explain in part why the far majority of evil acts are committed by normal or average people rather than criminals and violent sociopaths. The failure to construct barriers affecting our conscious choice of actions is only one such component of evil, regardless if it is unconsciously conceived or organized. Therefore, the barrier theory of evil confirms to a deeper structuralization process we may refer to as the defense theory of evil, which is subject to the free reins of imagination, mediated by unconscious fantasy and compromise formation. As a semiotic, the word evil has become too readily equated with moral outrage, which always stands in relation to a value judgment. And since a value judgment is a human phenomenon, the criterion of determine a proper interpretation of a concept of evil remains our task. We have already determined that evil may be ensconced in the realm of thought and not merely action, and that violence is interred in thought. Thoughts can do violence to those who think and harbor them, who suffer, let's say, due to unremitting hate. And they manifest in the most normative of situations, such as through symptoms, socialization, affect dysregulation, sleep dysfunction, memory disturbance, and so forth. Here, thought may be a form of self-evil, even if it is self-instituting and involuntary. hence the product of one's own self-victimization, even if such original victimization was due to the encroachment and internalization of the other. Now, this has some implications for what Hegel has to say. Rather than focus on the myriad forms of evil, and we could go on forever, that appear throughout humanity, and they're just innumerable, let's address evil as appearance as such. It was Hegel who famously argued that essence must appear, for appearance is the requisite for anything to be made actual. So, in other words, if something's real, it has to appear. This simple yet sophisticated observation is logically prepared. The coming into being of any phenomenon is ontologically conditioned on its essential a priori fulcrum. Something has to bring that into being. Here we may summon the principle of sufficient reason. Every mental event must stand in relation to its original form from which it is derived. In other words, there must be an original ground for every mental event that stands in relation to every mental object. For Hegel, appearance is essence, for nothing can exist unless it is real. Hence, it has being or presence. Here, evil appears as essence, revealed through its marbled modes of manifestation. Now, Hegel's doctrine on essence is conditioned on the notion that whatever comes into being is always mediated by its previous appearances. Evil is mediated by prior shapes, the conduit that allows psychic reality to appear as concrete reality. This includes human history, as well as any contextualization of our thrownness, what I've referred to as archaic primacy. This further means that evil has a prehistory and a metaphysical structure. Appearance emerges from a primordial ground. In the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel says, the inner world, or supersensible beyond, has come into being. It comes from the world of appearance, which has mediated it. In other words, appearance is its essence, and in fact its filling. The supersensible is the sensuous and the perceived, posited in the truth. But the truth of the sensuous and the perceived is to be appearance. The supersensible is therefore appearance qua appearance. Now, what this means, this inner world he talks about, is none other than our psychic world. An unconscious presencing that has been made objectively real, the instantiation of the evil within. Essence appears, and an appearance fills its essence, is what he's saying. More specifically, appearance fills with essence. The truth, as he says, is posited thought in itself as a supersensible beyond, something beyond the sense. But it may never be beyond appearance, for truth is equated with appearance as such. So in Hegel's, what he's trying to get at here is that what we think is actually real. In order for something to be real, it must appear. So it must appear, let's say, as thought. This makes evil an ontological presence within humanity. But the ontology of evil is not a static or a hypostasized thing. It's not a thing. Rather, it's a process of emergence that's always transforming, leaving debris in its path. In fact, Hegel warns us that evil is not fixed or simply contained in an absolute unity with the good, but rather it wants to be on its own account, as he says, as a semblance toward, or as a semblance of inward negativity, one that is exteriorized. So the negativity within must manifest. It must materialize in order for evil to be actual. Its reality is to be found in its appearances, but it lies deeply hidden within its interior, an interior that conditions all appearance, evil or otherwise. Now, I know this is dense and heavy. Let me try to put it in contemporary terms. He argues that evil is to be equated with cognition itself, due to what he calls a schism or a split, or what he calls a universal separation from immediate knowledge or unity with the good, a cleavage introduced through the act of thinking and self-reflection, a turning away from the simple unity of, quote, innocence in the moral sphere, end quote. Now here he evokes the Mosaic myth of the fall. Man is sinful by nature, and here we need no sophisticated theory to argue that humankind transgresses on itself and within itself, that it surpasses limit and restraint, and by definition, this is the same function ascribed to thinking itself. Thinking violates innocence. It breaches simplicity. It breaks up unities through intuiting negation, through difference, through instituting self-reflection as internal relation. As Hegel puts it, it is thinking that both inflicts the wound and heals it again, end quote. In the garden lies the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, the cognition of good and evil. And herein stands our entry into antithesis, the forbidden, the realm of the not. Cognition wants to surpass itself, to explore new territory, to enact its desire, the desire to know, and to transgress its curtailment of knowledge. This is the saga of the human spirit, or Geist, as mind discontent with its immediacy, the fate of desire enslaved as self-relation, wanting to satiate the lack. What Hegel concludes is nothing other than profound. Mankind by nature is evil, not because we are born of original sin, but because we think. It is only on the condition that we are autonomous subjects that make us evil. For this is the price of freedom, one that, quote, wills in his particularity without reference to the universal, end quote, that is, without considering other people. This is why Hegel concludes that evil is individual subjectivity. In other words, our subjective experiences and actions are the locus of ignobility, which stand in opposition to all objective corollary holding itself up to be a universal ideal, namely humanity's symbolic Godhead. We cannot live up to our own ideals that we impose for ourselves, and hence we fall short. The Greeks defined truth through a privative expression, aletheia, which means truth in Greek. And it's through the via negativa, a negation or a reversal of the closed or the unseen. Evil is disclosed through its openings, or more precisely, through its openness into the light of being. Evil as appearance is everywhere, even if hidden, concealed, or non-manifest, dwelling below in the cellar of non-appearance, waiting to be born, unveiled, released. Evil's disclosedness or unconcealment reveals a particular truth about the inherent nature of our pathos, one that feels compelled to no longer remain hidden. This holding fuels a festering that cannot be contained, as it is destined to make itself known, to show itself, to shine. The shining of evil is the face of man, the image of a fallen ideal, the petty iteration of subjectivity, the human mirror of self-negativity. We live in a sick society, one chosen yet unconsciously determined. Here, evil is the natural consequence of the cost of freedom. We kill people for this cost, for the privilege, politics, and principle of freedom, itself a lamentable and ethically dubious dilemma. Military intelligence has studied and strategized about the best way to kill people, to deracinate, to dismember their spirits, to rob them of soul, to crush entire peoples of their dignity, to the degree that warfare and state murder have become both a technological and mechanized industry. A weapon is an instrument designed to kill, from the steel and bronze age to a drone. The atomic bomb was invented for one thing: human extinction. The technology of evil is witnessed every day on our television sets, from Wall Street to mass-scale corporate corruption to internet fraud and cyberbullying, all abetted by advances in computer science. The use of global information exchange, digital communication, social media, robotics, nanotechnology, and the engineering of terror has become its own science. From WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, to the Arab Spring and Charlie Hebdo, no nation is immune from its own homegrown transgressions. Sometimes the craft or art of techne enlists a certain psychological intelligence condoned through state torture, such as inducing learned helplessness through waterboarding and rectal rehydration at Guantanamo, to rape warfare used in the ethnic cleansing campaigns perpetrated in Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, and Rwanda. The ethics of evil is the distortion of an inverse relation, namely the justification of self-righteousness while perpetrating evil under the guise of moral superiority. When ethical arguments are employed to justify evil acts, we reason in a hegemonic circle of self-interest that betrays a philosophy of right, even if such actions are deemed necessary in order to combat an identifiable threat. Ethical rationale can be exercised by any individual, group, or nation state to legitimate its activities and foreign policies affecting other lives, regardless of the legitimacy of one's belief system, veracity of events, or the flimsiness of moral reasoning employed. Under the rubric of national security and the crusade against terror, people simply disappeared into CIA custody. They were detained against their wills without criminal charges laid, and systematically subjected to the use of, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques, a euphemism for torture, in the hopes that reliable intelligence could be procured despite the legal and ethical prohibitions against torture instituted since the Geneva Convention's forbiddenness of it during times of war. Not only is this a good example of moral hypocrisy under the justification of state ethics, as are drone attacks, military commissions, and mass electronic surveillance by a superpower that bases its global political platform on democracy, freedom, and human rights, it furthermore underscores the universality of national self-interest at the expense of democracy itself. When nation is against nation, narcissistic national identity forms a firm antithesis against the other that becomes legalized within state foreign policy or totalitarian rule, even if duped or diluted Under the Bush administration following 9/11, the United States manufactured a war on terror because it needed to have enemies to pillory as revenge for its castrated ego. Here the other becomes alien, a xenophobic object prone to hurt us. And after they found Saddam Hussein tucked away down a spider hole, there were no weapons of mass destruction to be found. But he served a utilitarian public purpose. He was the symbolic bad man who was put to death under state execution, itself a practice deemed evil, despite enjoying a cathartic welcome by the West. We may readily observe the paranoid position at work on a global scale. Alterity, otherness, is the enemy. The primal fear is even further spread within our own nations and communities, where private lives are under state surveillance, neighbors spy upon neighbors, race riots are on the rise, and home invasions are the norm. Under Big Brother, anyone could disappear. And with global economic unrest due to the fuel crisis, Russia's infringement on the Ukraine to seemingly attempt to recover its lost Soviet Union has generated a new paranoia, where citizens can't speak freely due to the fear of police arrest or public assassination. Paradoxically, after the country had lost almost half of its value and people couldn't afford a mortgage payment, the nation's approval ratings for Vladimir Putin skyrocketed. Whereas in the United States, the disgruntled public craves a swing of the pendulum toward any politician selling hope for a recovering economy, Russia can't get enough of its leader while blaming the greedy West for its own financial malaise. When the class genocide in Rwanda occurred, initiated by rival ethnic tensions between the Hutsis and Tutsis, where mass mayhem organized by Hutu paramilitary personnel and locals, having much to gain from the systemic extermination of the Tutsis, the world remained curiously passive and silent. Even after reports of entire villages and individual family members killing their own kind with machetes and the crudest of utensils were known to be factual, the West looked on as a detached spectator, unwilling to do anything until it was too late. Lethargic in its enthusiasm to intervene, after nearly 1 million dead, world superpowers finally felt motivated to lift a finger to stop the genocide at the UN's beckoning. The Dark Continent, I suggest, held little value to democratic and developed countries who had little to gain and many economic costs to bear for intervening in a country that is symbolically associated with poverty, famine, AIDS, overpopulation, and disease, hence the alien other. But when SARS, swine flu, and Ebola can conjure up the paranoid position and threaten a global epidemic, the world has become more gracious and attuned to social realities that affect us all. The cold hard facts are that some peoples and countries are valued over others based upon their discernible worth, others on their discernible threat. Even humanitarian aid is never devoid of political self-interest, especially if it means thwarting global anxiety. Is it evil not to think of other peoples, cultures, and continents? To not consider their needs and social challenges? This would not only imply an admonition as failure to acquire self-consciousness and empathic attunement for the other, but rather incites a intransient condemnation for not caring to do so in the first place. Yet, Levinasian ethics barely occurs to the masses engrossed in their everyday lives, let alone being handed down a moral sentence for not thinking about the plight of the disenfranchised abstract sufferer residing somewhere in an arbitrary land. It is too much for the individual psyche to bear. That's why it's turned over to the collective social psyche to contemplate and do something about. Even in the most well-intentioned and conscientious soul who envisions a better humanity and wishes to serve altruistic causes, in the end, we do what we can, because that's all we can do. Is it evil that we don't do more, that we cease to try because we value our own needs over others? Or do we merely accept our humanism, that we cannot live up to the demands of our own ideals we place on ourselves? Here I'm reminded of Hegel's beautiful soul. When we become aware of our imperfections, we bear an unhappy consciousness. Here the self is divided. We can posit the ideal, but we can't really actualize it. Here moral lassitude becomes another banality. So I'm going to finish my lecture with a final segment on the notion of institutionalization. When we think about the institutionalization of evil, just in recent times, from colonial imperialism, totalitarianism, and fascism, we often think of large-scale superstructures that superimpose an oppressive bureaucratic machinery on its citizenry. But we may observe how these unconscious cultural fantasies operate as entrenched ideologies, unquestioned by the masses. The caste system in India may be said to foster a form of institutional racism, where social class is determined by blood, history, custom, and skin color. The upper class or Brahmins hold wealth, power, status, and education, while the untouchables are held in contempt and allocated the most unpleasant and revulsive of all vocations in the most horrid of conditions, such as in sanitation, domestic servitude, and back-breaking manual labor. Aryan descendants with light-skinned pigments are more aesthetically valued, while the more darker-skinned Indians are viewed as ugly, an attitudinal phenomenon we may also witness in Africa. There is an air of superiority by birth and provenance, and an aura of disdain, condemnation, and vilification of the underclass, even though the advantaged groups rely on their sweat and subservience for their privileged lifestyles. Huge discrepancies between rich and poor determine the social infrastructure, where the elite govern the masses. Political and social institutions are rife with corruption and abuse of power, and the citizenry have neither tangible access to housing, education, or work. The subcontinent is suffocating in pollution, and every major city is a conglomeration of slums. Poverty, death, disease, crime, infestation, filth, lack of sewage, vagrants, panhandlers, homelessness, frantic desperation, and abject hopelessness abound, where the majority of its billion people are illiterate, disenfranchised, and penniless. In fact, India has the highest illiteracy rate in the world, followed by China and sub-Saharan Africa. Abandoned children, the deformed and handicapped, and destitute mothers roam the streets begging for food with emaciated babies in their arms. I was there. An endless swarm of hovering hands pounce on tourists and locals alike, hoping to get a rupee or an American dollar for free. Fairy tale romances are non-existent for marriages that are arranged by patriarchy based upon caste, birth, and class as a union of families, not love, where relationships are determined, not freely chosen, lest one betrays the family, and hence establish social order, and the entrenched cultural tradition that sustains the institutional practice. It is no wonder why Buddhism branched off from Hinduism, and that Islam was successful in converting much of the underclass, each under the teachings that all men are equal regardless of race, caste, or custom. In other developing countries, such as the Middle East, where despots, dictators, and autocrats rule their totalitarian regimes, women and children are systematically oppressed, often under the edicts of Islam. Here we may observe a widespread institutional practice in most Arab countries that grant men legislative and property rights over their wives and children, where strict observance to Muslim law is harshly imposed, including denying women access and rights to education, individual autonomy, and independent finances in order to keep them enslaved, including controlling their dress, physical mobility, and behavioral practices, and granting them virtually no criminal protection or civil liberty rights under the law. It's just unfathomable in the United States. Women and children may be beaten or raped against their will by men with practical immunity from prosecution, and transgressions by females may be subject to penalty by death. Public stoning, immolations, and honor killings from Pakistan to Canada, where women turn on other accused women, including mothers and family members who are willing participants, are salient phenomenon fueled by culturally ingrained misogyny. In vast parts of China and India, female sex-selected infanticide is ubiquitous due to the cultural devaluation of women. Concentrated in Northeast Africa, Yemen, Iraqi Kurdistan, the Middle East, and portions of Asia, female genital mutilation, or circumcision, is legally imposed against their will, usually in childhood, often under horrendous unsanitary conditions that permanently disfigure and endanger the survival of its victims due to lack of sterilization and post-medical complications, all condoned under the dominion of male patriarchy. These primitive practices are designed to fortify a man's power and authority by turning women into functional objects of domestication, obedience, and sexuation, where only a man has the right to pleasure. Furthermore, in many of these countries, as throughout South and East Asia, children are sold into slavery by parents to pay for family debt or for profit, as are human organs offered on the black market to help pay for passage to another land. Human trafficking and child sex trade industry have become an international pandemic, often abetted by institutional corruption and systemic pathology thriving on high profit margins with no signs of a conscience. Israeli legislative policy is designed to promote and privilege an exclusive Jewish state, actively recruits immigration from European Jewry, hence lending asylum and giving economic and material benefits, including housing, transportation, and tax shelters to Jews over non-Jewish Israelis. It imposes higher costs of living and excise taxes on domestic Palestinians and other Israeli Arabs who refuse to live and work in the West Bank, although entire generations had previously owned property and ran family businesses throughout the country before the declaration of Israel. A democratic state that maintains class privilege and financially rewards one ethnic group over others who live and work in the same country, own property, and are equally part of the same society would be an unfathomable occurrence in North America. Israel is concerned with occupying rather than compromising over disputed land, and retaliates with military bombardments that deliberately target civilian neighborhoods when innocent lives are lost. And with Palestinian resistance compelled to fight and galvanize subversive insurgencies and initiate clandestine missile fire, keeping hate and resentment alive, Israeli citizens break out the lawn chairs, crack a beer, and watch the military pick off houses in Gaza. Here, each side points the finger while calling the other terrorist. This is a good example of the paranoid schizoid position at play, where radical splitting and projection leads to reiterations of violence as proportional exchange, like a ping pong ball traversing each side of the net until one opponent slams a victory in the current round. But this is followed by endless rounds of repetitions and fixed perpetuation of retaliatory aggression, to the point that systemic acrimony toward the other justifies state institutional racism and military barrages. It is understandable how Israel suffers from dread due to centuries of European and Russian anti-Semitism while living in the shadow of the Holocaust. But with the messianic clash of religions and fundamentalist supporters of Islamic State recently killing Jews in Paris and Copenhagen, the tinderbox could explode without warning, especially if Iran continues with its nuclear development program, a spark that could ignite a third world war. So here we have it. No one is immune from evil or innocent, for everyone by nature is evil. It is merely a matter of degree and how it is enacted. Let us hope that our individual self-awareness and social self-consciousness stop our charades of denial, and that we start to begin by asking, what are we going to do about it? Thank you.